peaceful in family was re-established. But still, my father always said, I'm very proud being beaten by my own daughter and not by someone else. And probably I was the only one who co-financed his non-re-election.
So you see, Swiss politics is quite interesting and funny at times. How is that with you, Mrs. Kindernell, with the motivation?
Yes, it was the same as for Claudine, the male supremacy. It was not me who kicked my father out, as in the case of Christa. It was my father who kicked me into politics. My father was a right-wing politician, so it was clear that I became a socialist politician. Growing up in a right-wing family, 7 kilometers of here, up on the hills, in a village which was traditionally half farming, half workers. I'll tell you why on 3 examples. When I was about 5 years old, 1958, it was before the 1959 vote on the suffrage for women. And I discovered in our living room, my mother was typing on a very old typewriter the minutes of the right-wing coalition against women's suffrage. And I talked about that with my parents, and they tried to convince me of that, and I said, no, not with me, not with me. Women and men, the same rights, nothing else. It was class system. I discovered at about the same age, 5, 6, 7 years, that on the farm on which my father had grown up, also in the same village, the Italian worker who came in the 50s to replace a Swiss worker that got retired was paid much less, but had to work 7 years. And I could not accept that. Later on, my sister was refused here in Bern from entering into a nursing school. She wanted to become a nurse. And the answer of the head of the school was, we only take girls from good families. Okay, we knew we are not from a good family. Okay, so that is my motivation until I die to fight for a society wherein class can be overcome and whereby class shall not discriminate people.
Okay. Thank you. We'll come back to the women's right of vote, and but first we want to complete the introductory round and tell us something about your connections. You already started with it. Your connections with the United States. Yeah, Cecilia.
I'm a big fan of the United States. I often go there for vacation. My dad often took us kids with him, and he had to work in the United States. So for me it was always a big adventure to be there and to discover it. I never lived there. For instance, I'm working in politics, so our best thing is go to St. Gallen or Locarno and Geneva, and then it stops, unfortunately. I'm very interested also in how to do campaigning in the United States, and I followed the elections, and I think it's very interesting for us here in Switzerland what we can take over and how it works also with the social media, and so I'm always following what happens in the US.
Thank you. Ms. Schmidt, you were, how you say that in English, Synchronschwimmer, and that's your experience, right?
Well,
with America?
It's a long time ago. As I said, in 1984, for 3 months I was there in San Jose, California, visiting a friend, and I loved it. I like it very, very much. I had a really great time, but at that time I wasn't interested in women's issues. I wasn't interested yet in politics, so I didn't really observe. But what I always kept in mind, there's one big difference between the US and Switzerland. Can you imagine when my son was 5 years old, he went to school in the morning at 9 o'clock, he came back at 11, he went again to school at 2 o'clock and he came back at 4. And I knew in the US that would never happen. So that's always, I keep that always in mind. And when we talk about this kind of family subjects in politics, I tell them that in other countries it works better.
Thank you. Mrs. Marquardt, are you a fan of the US too?
Of course I am, since if not, I would not have become the chairwoman of the Parliamentarian Friendship Association, Switzerland-US. And when I was a candidate for that, by the way, against a man, but by a chance I was elected by 1 vote in favor. I was also asked, what are your relations? Because you didn't study in the US, you didn't live for a longer time in the US. Well, there are some links, because my great-grandparents emigrated to the United States, and it could have happened that I grew up in the United States, but they came back because it was a difficult time. It was in the 1920s, and they were there as farmers during the Prohibition. All their neighbors were smugglers. They wanted to pull them into the smuggle rings, and they didn't want to destroy their future, so they were attacked and they had to go to hospital, and her small daughter, who was at that time a baby, that was my grandma, she grew up during the first year in other families, and so my great-grandparents decided to come back to Switzerland. But still today I have relatives in the United States. Both of my cousins live there. My uncle is American and lives here. And so I have a lot of connections also within my family to the US. And of course I also regularly travel to the US. Last year I was, I think, about 3 times there.
Wow.
Very interesting stories we hear this afternoon. Mrs. Keenan-Ellen, you lived in the US, right?
Yes, I had the big chance in my life to be able to do an American Field Service scholarship for 1 year in the States from 1970 to 1971. I was a senior at high school in northern Wisconsin, Appleton, Wisconsin, near Green Bay. And for me, it was a very, very important year in my life because it was really my opening to the world. Imagine me arriving from a small farmers' workers' village here to New York, at the time, to Long Island for the introduction camp. And I had the chance to live in 2 marvelous families. The first family was a Jewish family. Then due to a death within that family, I moved to a Lutheran family. So that was also interesting from the religious point of view. And both families had 4 children. So I had more sisters and brothers than here in Switzerland. And in both families, the mother and the father were working full-time. So that was really, for me, a very interesting experience. It was in the period of the Vietnam War. It was in the period where President Nixon almost every evening called on the US citizens over television that we must win that war. And then again, 2 or 3 times per year, the whole population of the town where I lived, Appleton, Wisconsin, especially the students, were called to go to the airport to take the dead GIs that were flown back. So I experienced this huge schizophreny of a war. But on the other hand, I was very impressed by the Black movement, Black liberation movement, which is something I cannot live in Europe. And I was very impressed with the women's liberation movements. All the papers I wrote during that year at high school were on those 2 movements. And that fit in very well within my political soul at the time.
Thank you very much. We can come back to the US-Swiss relationship, maybe in the question and answer round, but I also said we want to talk about Swiss mountains, right? So let's do this. Many think Switzerland has been a role model with its democracy, but why then did it take us so long to allow women to vote and get elected into office? That was in 1971, half a century after American women got the right to vote. What was wrong in Switzerland? Mr. Seiler, you're born after 71, but does it still bother you? What happened then?
Yes, for sure, but it's actually very logical because the men had to give us the right. And that's the direct democracy. So it was really absurd. The first votation was in 59, and it was always the movement that still the men had to decide if women can have the right to vote. So a lot of people say if the other European countries, also Americans, should have this vote, it would also take a long time. And very funny is that even the last canton up until Ausserrhoden or Innerrhoden, I'm not sure anymore, Innerrhoden, they had to be forced by the federal tribunal in '92, which is really that, when we tell that people who don't know it, it's really absurd.
What do the others think about it? Just feel free to.
Well, I was also born afterwards. I was born 4 years after the introduction of the women's right to vote, and there is also an objective explanation for this. Claudine mentioned the internal political process, but in nearly all other European countries it happened that after the World War II, World War II, the right for women was introduced because the women were running the businesses and looking after children and having their households, and when men came back from war, they also called for having the right to vote, and that's why in other European countries it was, or in most of the other European countries, it was introduced. And in Switzerland often things take a little bit longer and it took really a long time, but of course today we are not only speaking about the same rights for men and women, but also the same position in society and having the same chances, having the same salaries. So this is always still a discussion going on.
So the slow decision on women's political rights is apparently due to the system of direct democracy, in which the people has much power actually. Which is a role model all over the world. But is it really so good, and how has it influenced Swiss politics? Please.
It has certainly contributed to stability, but stability also means not being able to move much ahead. That's the negative part of it. The reason why it took so long to introduce female suffrage in Switzerland is exactly the same that prevented the country from accepting this constitutional amendment last Sunday. It's exactly the same thing. It's the structure.
Could you please explain to our foreign
yes. It's the structure that for a people's initiative, that 100,000 citizens can collect with their signatures. Usually the parties do it or other organizations do it. In order to accept such a constitutional amendment, we need two majorities. We need one, the people's majority, which we had last Sunday, by about 54%.
A strong majority voted
for an initiative it's a good result, but at the same time we need majority of the states called cantons, our cantons. And that is the handicap of Switzerland. It was the handicap as it was discussed for the introduction of female suffrage, because especially the Swiss-German small cantons. I'm a bilingual, like French-German, like Claudine, and it's especially tenacious in the Swiss-German part that we often cannot get the majority of the states because we have very small states in the central part of Switzerland and also in the eastern part of Switzerland. And although the city populations would like to move ahead in terms of reforms of the society, then those very small rural or mountain cantons which are backward in the Swiss-German part, they prevent these steps. That's the structure.
Do you want to change that, Mrs. Marquardt?
No, I don't want to change the fact that the Swiss constitution can only be amended by a double majority, because I think we have anyway a rather weak constitution, especially compared with the United States. When you hear that you only need to collect 100,000 signatures and then bring this to a popular vote, I think it's good to have a double majority and gives also a weight to smaller states. Of course, it can have also negative impacts for certain topics,